Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all see us. It's a great pleasure for me. My name is John Harper, by the way. I'm Emeritus Professor of American Foreign Policy at CITES Europe. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Eliza Gheorghe. Eliza is Assistant Professor of International Relations at Bilkent University in Ankara. And the title of her talk tonight is Balance of Power Redux: Nuclear Alliances and the Logic of Extended Deterrence. Now, Eliza received her BA at the University of Bucharest in her native Romania. She then went to Georgetown University, where she got an MA in Security Studies on a Fulbright scholarship before going on to do her PhD at Oxford University under the supervision of Professor Ann Dighton. And during the time she was working on her PhD, she was also in 2013-14, she was a George Abernethy pre-doctoral fellow here at CITES Europe. So she's very familiar with the surroundings. It's a pity you can't be here in person, Eliza, but this is the next best thing. Let me also mention that she, after finishing her PhD, she has held a series of prestigious postdoctoral fellowships, including one at Hamburg University, Yale, Harvard Kennedy School, Cornell, University of Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. And she's quite recently, the recipient of the International Fellowship for Outstanding Researchers from the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. She is, I think it's fair to say, one of the leading young scholars in the world today in the field of nuclear history. She has published in some of the most prestigious journals in the field of international security. Well, that journal itself, International Security, she published an article in 2019 called Proliferation and the Logic of the Nuclear Market. And Eliza, it's great to see you. Wish you could be here in person, but the floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just mention, as you probably know, you can use the Q&A function to send questions as soon as you like. And when Eliza has finished speaking after 45 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. So Eliza, great to see you.
Thank you very much, Professor Harper. It's wonderful to see you, and it's wonderful to see everyone in Bologna. I really wish I could be there in person. I was saying this a little bit earlier, that my time in Bologna was one of the most wonderful years of my life. And that is thanks to the vibrant intellectual environment that I found there, and as well as Professor Harper's expert supervision. I actually want to thank him for sowing the seed for this paper in 2013, 2014 during our meetings. He was the one to point me in a direction that until then didn't really occur to me to go down the road of. And I'm really curious, and I'm very grateful for his advice and for his guidance on this issue. His work also has a lot to do, and I'm building on it in this paper, which, as the title indicates, deals with a crucial, I hope it's a crucial aspect in international relations, and that is extended nuclear deterrence. So I will share my screen. I think that should be a possibility at this moment. Okay, I will try again. All right, if you don't mind me just taking one more second to do this, I think it should work now.
We can see the first slide.
Okay, wonderful. So now you have a full screen and everything is working okay, right? Resume share. So it should be fine. All right, so I'm looking at nuclear alliances, specifically NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and I'm interested in how they offered how they provided extended nuclear deterrence, how they provided protection to their member states. So the basic question I'm trying to answer in this work is how nuclear alliances function, how they offer security to their participants, to countries that are part of them. And there are some important subsidiary questions to this big research question. One of them is who gets to have nuclear weapons and why? And the second one is basically why do alliances choose particular deterrent strategies? They have not just one option. I argue they have at least three. And I'm trying to find out exactly why they went for one and the other and not a third one. A very quick note here. I am interested in unbalanced nuclear alliances. These are nuclear alliances where there is a leading power that has nuclear weapons, and it provides protection to weaker states. There's also the possibility of having a balanced alliance where there are roughly equal members. They have roughly equal military capabilities, but to this day, there has not been such an alliance in international relations that has nuclear weapons. So the two examples I'm focusing on, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, were both unbalanced nuclear alliances. Other scholars use the term asymmetric nuclear alliances. For me, it's unbalanced because there is no equality in terms of capabilities between the member states. So this is what I'm curious to know. This is what I'm trying to answer in this work. And I'll come back maybe a little bit to the beginnings and how Professor Harper was instrumental to this paper a little bit later on. So what do we know so far? Well, about nuclear alliances and nuclear weapons. Well, if we go back to Ken Waltz's idea of how to deter an enemy or what kind of purpose alliances serve, then we should have seen both alliances equipping and sharing nuclear weapons among all the members so that they could balance more effectively against the other side. This would be a very basic, a very sort of generic understanding, a very common understanding of the balance of power. And this, I should mention, is an inter-alliance balance of power between the two blocs. So the US should have had nuclear weapons and it should have shared them with everybody else. The same should have happened with the Soviet Union and its allies. This is what I would call traditional neorealism. This is what traditional neorealism makes us expect when we think about how deterrence has been provided over the course of the nuclear age. Then we could also draw on the work of IR scholars like Thomas Riese-Kappen and others who argue that the member states have particular regime types, and the way these alliances function is a result of the regime type inside the alliance among the member states. So NATO, according to Thomas Riese-Kappen, was an alliance of democracies, and therefore it functioned a particular way. And then the Warsaw Pact was an alliance of autocracies, and we have the Soviet Union dominating the Eastern European states, and therefore it provided protection in a completely different way than NATO. And this is not just a theoretical construct, or it's not just an idea put forward by scholars. This is also how people in general, I would say, would think about these two alliances, and also policymakers. They believed that NATO was fundamentally different from the Warsaw Pact. So NATO was united for freedom. Its nature was a democratic one. And then here you see this little cartoon here with the Soviet bear encroaching and keeping everybody else in Eastern Europe under its claw. So those are a couple of derivations from liberal theory, from regime type theory. There's another option, also building on what liberal theorists have had to say about alliances. And here, the alliance is actually a security institution. So whatever it offers, the kind of protection I'm curious and I'm trying to explain is actually a function of the institutional mechanisms that are set up to allow this alliance to function. So there were proposals over the course of the Cold War, but also there are explanations, scholarly explanations about this that focus on supranationalism or intergovernmentalism. And in the case of the two alliances, or especially in the case of NATO, we can think about mechanisms such as a rotational command that would give the alliance itself actually the ability to order the use of nuclear weapons. So the protection that the alliance offers would be a function of the decision made by the alliance as an actor in international relations, international security. And then if it's not an intergovernmental, if it's not a rotational command where members take turns, but they are supposed to serve the interests of everybody else, not just their own home country, we can also go to another possibility, another variant of this, and that is the alliance itself being a supranational entity. So it's not necessarily that member states have control or even own nuclear weapons anymore. No, this is about the alliance having its own nuclear force. And with NATO, we know that there have been several proposals in that direction, even in parallel as NATO was just getting set up. We have supranational ideas or supranational projects happening in Europe, the EDC being an example. And the whole point there is that instead of member states, instead of nation states making a call about when nuclear weapons should be used, it's the institution itself. So this is what we currently know. These are some existing explanations of how alliances use nuclear weapons to protect the member states. But what I have discovered is that, first of all, neither of these plans panned out. And then in some cases, there is maybe some veracity, there's some correspondence in real life for these predictions, but they're not as powerful as the kind of explanation I'm trying to put forward. I'm not unfair here. I will give you a sense of how these events unfolded. I'll compare the END strategies. END here stands for extended nuclear deterrence in the case of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So my argument, instead of looking at what's happening between alliances or what's happening with the regime types of alliances or what's happening with the institutional setup of alliances, it's actually looking at what's happening within the alliance. And here I'm focusing on the intra-alliance balance of power. I argue that the END strategy an alliance adopts is a result of the configuration of power, the distribution of power among the member states. And this was something that at the beginning, when I was just starting this project, a lot of people dismissed, or they thought this is not a correct use of the concept because balance of power should only apply between enemies. But I think it's legitimate to extrapolate or to stretch this concept to look at what's happening within alliances because the member states, the countries that made up these alliances thought in those terms. And they were concerned about how they fared, whether they had roughly equal power or a lot less power than other countries inside the alliance. And here's where I come and I'm grateful, and I would like to thank Professor Harper for his amazing work on American Visions of Europe, where he discusses and he shows how Europeans sometimes resented the fact that the Americans were their masters, for instance. They wanted to be equal partners, not to be bossed around by Washington. But this idea that he captured and then that I'm adopting in my work is only possible if we actually accept the fact that there would be power differentials within an alliance. Alliances are not insulated from these kinds of considerations. So given the fact that or if you accept that there is this configuration, there is this distribution of power within the alliance, then we can think of several options. One is where the leading power is overwhelmingly more powerful than the other member states. So we could call it the dominator. The leading power is the dominator in this case, and the junior partners or the weaker members are dependents. In that case, I call this kind of alliance an Imperial Alliance. And I argue that the kind of END strategy it adopts is a nuclear straitjacket. With a nuclear straitjacket, the weaker members are protected, but they don't have a lot of leverage. They cannot really influence the decisions that the dominator is making regarding nuclear use. They are sometimes not consulted, they can be coerced, their concerns are dismissed. So they still benefit from being in this alliance, but they don't have a lot of say in it. And that's because they are so much weaker compared to the leading power. In a second variant, the leading power is still much more powerful than any single other weaker member, but overall the hegemon is roughly equal compared to all the other members combined. So if they were to create a united front, could hold their own vis-a-vis the leading power. And in this case, I call the leading power a hegemon, and the weaker powers, the weaker members, I call them junior partners. This kind of alliance type, in my conception, is a hegemonic alliance, and the kind of END strategy it applies is a nuclear umbrella. And then there is a third option, which falls outside the scope, or I haven't been able to find an example of this kind of alliance where all member states are roughly equal. This would be a balanced alliance, and I argue that this would result in a nuclear partnership. This is what we should imagine happening. So the nuclear partnership should be the END strategy that NATO or the Warsaw Pact or any alliance that is in competition with another bloc should adopt to be able to balance more effectively. This is what Ken Waltz's theory of international politics would predict, that we should see a nuclear partnership. We should see nuclear weapons spreading. He is the one who's telling us that more is better. But as I said before, I haven't been able to find an example of such an alliance. So my focus in today's presentation is on the imperial and the hegemonic type, and I will show that there were many attempts, or some attempts, where the two alliances wanted to adopt nuclear partnership, but they didn't happen because the configuration of power was not in place. So I'll first go to the imperial phase of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In the case of NATO, we have the US being the leading power or the dominator, and Western Europe, also Canada, being the dependents. This is the case even before NATO is created, so I could call it the US-led alliance, but here for just to be quicker and to be able to refer to this in a way that everybody understands, I'm referring to to NATO as such. It became a formal alliance in 1949, but from the beginning there was no institutionalized form for END consultation, for the junior partners to have a say in nuclear use, in how the US was planning to use its atomic weapons to protect the weaker members. So I call this a nuclear straitjacket, and I argue that it was in place from roughly 1945, or from when the US used nuclear weapons and became a nuclear weapon state, until roughly 1954. For the Warsaw Pact, the USSR was a dominant power. Eastern Europe, or countries in Eastern Europe, I should say, were its dependents. It became a formal alliance in 1955. And again, there was no institutionalized form of consultation on the issue of nuclear use. I would call this a nuclear straitjacket from the moment the Soviets obtained their nuclear bomb in 1949 until roughly 1956. So here we have a number of examples. This is not a comprehensive list. Examples of the kinds of behaviors that the leading powers were engaging in this initial phase. I should say that I'm not arguing that NATO and the Warsaw Pact were the same, they function in identical ways in every single respect. My point is that when it comes down to nuclear weapons and their use and the kind of nuclear protection these alliances were supposed to offer, they are strikingly similar. They both engaged in two kinds of behaviors that are characteristic of imperial alliances, and those involve coercion and dismissal. So how did this happen? Well, what the US and the Soviet Union did was to make sure that the top position, the top military position in the two alliances was reserved or was always in the hands of an American and or a Soviet respectively. So Sakir in the case of NATO was always an American officer. The Supreme Commander in the case of the Warsaw Pact was always a Soviet officer. Then when it comes down to the nuclear monopoly, both countries were very keen to be the only countries in their alliances to have nuclear weapons. And this may sound a bit counterintuitive because we also know that the UK and France acquired nuclear weapons. The UK in the first period, which goes until 1954, and France in 1960, so in the second period I will be looking at a little bit later. So here it may seem that NATO was really different from the Warsaw Pact because there are, in this first period, two nuclear weapon states. Well, that is actually not something that the US wanted. The US tried to thwart the British from acquiring nuclear weapons, and I would say they did everything they could. So one such activity or one such action was the fact that the US in 1946 adopted the Mcmahon Act, which curtailed cooperation with other countries and cut off the UK and the Canadians, the British and the Canadians, from the Manhattan Project to which they had contributed, and basically deprived their own allies of the fruits of their labor during World War II. This was something that deeply angered the British, not so much the Canadians, but the British who had their own qualms about American isolationism. They realized that the Americans were completely unfair when it came down to how they treated them, and that actually was the issue that prompted them to try and acquire and ultimately to succeed in getting their own nuclear weapons. And actually, Ernie Bevin said at one point that the way he was treated by the US Secretary of State was something that he wouldn't want any other foreign minister of the UK to experience, and that we must have this bloody bomb with the Union flag on it. So it was not because the US helped the British get nuclear weapons. Actually, they tried to prevent them from doing so by cutting off this cooperation, and also by adopting or proposing plans like the Baruch Plan that would result in the UK being legally prohibited from obtaining its own nuclear weapons. That, of course, the main object there might have been actually the Soviets, but the effect was across the board. It applied to London as well as to Moscow. Moreover, the US also tried to prevent the French from starting a nuclear weapons program. There were a few French scientists in the team that was part of the of Manhattan Project. Those French scientists were suspected by US officials of having ties or being moles, being spies for the Soviets and sharing their secrets, sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union. And they were actually put under house arrest, which is quite a dramatic measure taken against one's own allies. But this had to happen in the minds of US policymakers to prevent the French from starting their own nuclear program. Indeed, that did delay them for a while, but in the end, when the French got the message that the US was not the kind of ally they were hoping for, they went and for the bomb, and they established their own nuclear program and ultimately got the bomb in 1960. The US was also interested in exploiting its allies, such as Canada, for its own nuclear weapons program. So benefiting from the uranium reserves in Canada to build nuclear weapons from them without allowing Canada to benefit from the Manhattan Project. And in the end, it was also willing to resort to undemocratic actions, covert actions by the CIA, for instance, to avert defections from within the alliance. And here, a good example would be Italy, as well as France. Now, going to the USSR and the USSR-led alliance, what we see there is, again, the top position being given to a Soviet officer, then the Soviets also being very protective of their status as the only country with nuclear weapons. They knew that they had allies with substantial uranium reserves. Some of their allies, such as Romania, had scientists embedded in international teams working with leading scientists in the West. Those were also put under house arrest, a very similar move to what the Americans were doing. They also refused to let their allies know about what they were doing. Overall, they were very secretive, trying to keep their monopoly as much as, or for as long as possible. So here they had very similar non and counter proliferation policies. They tried to nip in the bud and to inhibit any idea among their allies to go for the bomb. They were also very keen to exploit the rich uranium reserves of the countries that were in their orbit, such as Czechoslovakia, and they did not hesitate to resort to the use of force to suppress defections, such as Hungary's announcement that they would want to leave the Warsaw Pact in 1956. That announcement that Hungary made, I should note, was interestingly, or maybe unfortunately for the Hungarians, very ill-timed. The Soviets had just announced that they were willing to withdraw their advisors from Eastern European countries to give them more freedom of action, to allow them to have more autonomy, especially in their foreign relations. But by then, the Hungarians had already declared that they were going to leave the Warsaw Pact. That would have exposed the southern flank of the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviets, with prodding from the Chinese, decided to invade and to put in place a regime that was going to remain within the Warsaw Pact, a more loyal regime. When it comes down to another kind of behavior, dismissal, we see a lot of similarities here as well. So in the case of NATO, the Canadians and the British requested that they be consulted by the US in the case of nuclear use. The US refused, dismissed their concerns, and said that the most they could do is just to inform them about when they would employ nuclear weapons. They also dismissed British requests for nuclear sharing. The British thought that they were entitled to at least a prototype of the bomb, given their contribution to the Manhattan Project. The Americans would hear none of it. And then, as I said before, they put in place the Mcmahon Act, which gave them a blanket policy of just turning down, rejecting any demand for nuclear assistance from ally, non-aligned country, from pretty much all countries around the world. And another instance of dismissal in the case of NATO was how the Americans thought about defending West Germany, the fact that they were only willing to defend Germany on the Rhine. By then, that meant that West Germany would have been pretty much all of it occupied by enemy forces. And they were simply not, the Americans were not willing or able, I should say, to defend Germany on the intra-German border. For the Warsaw Pact and the USSR-led alliance, we see again a lot of similarities, rejection of demands for nuclear sharing. That particular form of nuclear sharing was just this idea that if a communist country has nuclear weapons, the communist thing to do would be to share them with everybody else, from each according to their means, to all and to each according to their needs. And everybody would need nuclear weapons or protection nuclear weapons against imperialism and against capitalism. So the Soviets had a very similar approach to nuclear weapons. They were also confronted with another interesting idea, a tweak on nuclear sharing, which came from Poland. Poland wanted to have a rotational supreme commander of the Warsaw Pact, which would have meant that a Polish officer at one point would have their finger on the button. The Soviets also, I mean, they again dismissed and rejected such calls, and they maintained a fairly strict control, fairly strict centralized decision-making process within their own hands. To give another example of how they coerced, how they dismissed their requests and the security concerns of their allies, to give the example of what they did in East Germany. They actually famously even, they said that East Germany was not even a real state and it was only kept in place by Soviet troops. So they were aware of the fact that they were the puppeteers, that they were pulling the strings, but that was something that they could do at that point because of the enormous power gap between themselves and the weaker members. And that was also the case with the US and the Western Europeans. Now, when we go to the second phase of these alliances, or the second kind of END strategy that they applied, this happened and it was put in place as a result of the two alliances becoming hegemonic. What that meant was that there was a change in the intra-alliance balance of power within both NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And so from 1955, in the case of NATO, until roughly 1989, we see nuclear umbrella within NATO. And in the case of the Warsaw Pact, from roughly 1957 until 1989, we see the same kind of END strategy within the Warsaw Pact. Both alliances had plenty of troubles or experienced more turmoil than before, because now these junior partners had wanted to have more of a say and could assert themselves. In the case of NATO, we have a famous dissenter, which is France, leaving the alliance in 1966. And in the case of the Warsaw Pact, we have Albania de facto leaving the pact in 1961, 62, and then also in 1968 officially pulling out, and Romania causing trouble to the Soviet Union and claiming to be non-aligned, which was a title that it hoped it could use to extract benefits from the West. So now we'll take a look at a few examples of this kind of behavior. Again, we see some examples of coercion. The same applies to the top military position, the SACEUR in the case of NATO, and the Supreme Commander in the Warsaw Pact. They were again still an American and a Soviet. We also see on both sides a lot of efforts, a lot of energy spent by the superpowers to prevent their allies from getting nuclear weapons. That was the case with West Germany in NATO, and West Germany and Italy, and then Romania in the Warsaw Pact. Pressure applied by the superpowers on their allies to join the NPT. A good example here again would be West Germany and Romania, West Germany in NATO and Romania in the Warsaw Pact. And then there are some, of course, some similarities. There are also some differences. So with NATO, an interesting thing is that once the British got nuclear weapons, we would assume that there would be a duopoly. However, the US did its absolute best, and I would argue it actually succeeded in subordinating the British nuclear deterrent. It became a semi or quasi-independent nuclear deterrent, relying on American delivery systems for its operation. We don't have anything like that in the case of the Warsaw Pact, but that was not for lack of trying. As I said before, there were attempts by Warsaw Pact members to acquire nuclear weapons, Romania's example being the best one. The reason why Romania did not get nuclear weapons was not because it was in an alliance with an autocratic state. It was simply because its economy, its industry were not as powerful as that of Britain or France in the case of NATO to allow it to achieve this technological feat. In both cases, there were calls for creating nuclear sharing mechanisms that went beyond stationing nuclear weapons on allied territory, and instead gave control to the junior partners over these weapons. But both of those kinds of calls were suppressed. They were dismissed by the two leading states. When it comes down to specific examples of rotational command, now they they happen in both alliances. It's no longer just Poland, but actually in the Warsaw Pact case, Romania as well. And the Americans, together with the British and the Germans and the Italians, they also think about arrangements that would give junior partners a finger on the button one at a time. When it comes down to dismissal, the US also decided not to pay attention, to reject the calls from Turkey, for instance, not to withdraw the intermediate range ballistic missiles around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans, after all, did what they thought was best for them, not for Turkey. And in the case of the Warsaw Pact, we see a situation where Romania demanded tactical nuclear weapons that the Soviets promised them, but the Soviets in the end decided not to deliver them. So we have, again, this is not a comprehensive list of examples, but just a few of them to show just how much similarity there was when it comes down to nuclear weapons between these alliances. What we see now being introduced more, or two kinds of behaviors that the superpowers have to adopt to a larger extent once the alliances become hegemonic, are consultation and accommodation. And a very important part here is that the two leading states tie their own security to that of the junior partners by stationing nuclear weapons on their territory. In some cases, they consulted with them. For instance, the Soviets consulted with the Bulgarians when they deployed nuclear weapons there. The Americans consulted with the Germans, also with the Italians, and after a while with the Turks as well in other countries. They also trained junior allied troops to be able to engage in nuclear warfighting together with the superpower armies, and gave them a sense for how they would employ these nuclear warheads that were stationed on the territory of allied states. So this is actually, I would say, from my part, the biggest discovery, and it was completely accidental, the fact that there was this training and the Soviets thought about their junior partners. I can give you the example of Czech soldiers, for instance, and Czech troops, that they were going to use these warheads in combination with Soviet troops, of course, but they were going to use them in joint Warsaw Pact fighting on the battlefield. This is something that I would say surprised a lot of people as I was giving this talk, as I have talked to other scholars about this, because the idea that the Soviets would even think about giving this kind of information to their satellites, or as most people call them, is not something that has been talked about before. When the MLF proposals were shut down, just to move forward a little bit more, what we see is that the two superpowers had to throw a bone to their junior partners, and they created fora within the two alliances for consultation: the nuclear planning group in the case of NATO, and the military council within the Warsaw Pact. And when it comes down to accommodation, we see that junior partners are able to convince their patrons to allow them to take more responsibility, to allow them to be more involved. West Germany is now, after 1954, is allowed to have its own army. In the case of the Eastern European countries, we see them having national armies with their own commanders, and they get rid of Soviet advisors that would tell them what to do. And then we also see some sort of accommodation, or I would call this maybe more like toleration, where French withdrawal does not bring about any scolding. Actually, the Americans, I would say, are relieved that the French left. Same happens with Albania. In the Warsaw Pact, Albania left, as I said. But an interesting thing here is that Albania not only abandoned or defected from the alliance, but also stole 4 Soviet submarines from a base that was located on its territory, which I would say is surprising that they could get away with it, given what we know about how the Soviet Union behaved towards its junior partners. So these are, again, some examples to give us a sense for how the two alliances changed from the first period to the second period, and also for how they provided protection with the help of the nuclear weapons of the leading states. Now, what would have been the alternatives? As I said before, we could have had a multilateral force in the case of NATO. The same idea was discussed in the case of the Warsaw Pact. Neither of those materialized, but there were at least some replacements, some sort of substitutes for those hardware options. We could talk about the NPG and the Military Council being software options, where it's just about decision making, taking the concerns of the junior partners into account. That is a big difference for the second period compared to the first period. And then if I'm to summarize my findings, I'm aware that I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. We should have seen widespread proliferation and also nuclear partnership where all members of the alliance have nuclear weapons if traditional neorealism, if its predictions were indeed valid, if they had panned out. Then for the case of regime type theories, we shouldn't have seen a nuclear straitjacket applied by NATO in its first period. And also we shouldn't have seen a nuclear umbrella in the case of the Warsaw Pact, which was an autocratic alliance in the second period. So the fact that we have these kinds of END strategy for NATO and the Warsaw Pact, I would argue, goes against the predictions derived from regime type theories. And then when we go back to institutionalism, we see that the alliance or the two alliances did their best, of course, at the suggestion of various members, to strengthen their institutional framework, to become more autonomous, to actually be able to put decision-making power in the hands of the commander of the alliance, irrespective of where they came from, of their nationality. But there was no success in either alliance with those kinds of plans. There was no rotational command in NATO. There was no rotational command in the Warsaw Pact. There was no MLF in NATO. There was no MLF in the Warsaw Pact. That would tell me that suggests to me that this idea that AND is a function of what the alliance does as an actor in international relations did not pan out. So my bottom line is that NATO and the Warsaw Pact had strikingly similar END strategies throughout the Cold War. I would say there are almost mirror images when it comes down to nuclear weapons. The two superpowers dealt with their junior partners in the second period or dependents in the first period. They dealt with them in very similar ways. But again, I should emphasize, when it comes down to nuclear weapons, I'm not trying to argue that this is the case in every single other respect of alliance politics. But when it comes down to nuclear weapons, the two countries had strikingly similar approaches. And those approaches, I argue, were motivated by the changes in the intra-alliance balance of power. What does my approach and my argument tell us about what's to come in Europe? What should we expect for NATO? Well, as the US is now still, I would argue, considering giving more autonomy to its Western European, or I should say just overall European partners, we are likely to see some countries like France coming forward and trying to take the lead. And the question is, will others follow? So far, we haven't seen a lot of evidence that this is likely to happen. Actually, I would argue the contrary has happened. And Germany at this point is not interested in having a partnership for a Euro deterrent together with France. I would argue that my argument has a lot to say about this, and that's because France and Germany are roughly equal in terms of capabilities, and it would be difficult for Germany to want to be subordinated to France, and it would also be very difficult for France to actually share, to give nuclear weapons to another country like Germany. So for the time being, these kinds of ideas, the partnership that was announced, or the kind of Franco-German unity that was announced in Aachen, is not likely to lead to much at this point. Perhaps in very different, much more uncertain circumstances, there would be more push for truly European army, and that army would have to rely on the nuclear deterrent coming from France. But those kinds of arrangements would carve and would break new ground in how E&D strategies are done. And I'm actually not terribly optimistic that this is going to happen very quickly or very smoothly. On that note, thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eliza. That's very interesting and lucid and raises a lot of questions. And I certainly have a few of my own, but I'm going to go to the questions that have arrived on the Q&A function. I'm not sure if you can also see those and read them, but in any event, I will read them out loud for everyone. The first is from Connor O'Brien, and his question is, how do you quantify at a quote unbalanced unquote nuclear alliance such as NATO, where the US clearly has a qualitative advantage compared to the UK and France, but those systems might arguably be able to deter all adversaries on their own. The French and the British systems might be able to deter adversaries on their own. Would you like to answer that one?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. It's an excellent one. I didn't have the chance to go in more detail about this in my presentation. In the paper, I'm particularly focused on the balance of power within each alliance in a particular area, and that is the Central Front, where the Third World War was going to be fought. So I'm not necessarily thinking about overall US military capabilities compared to French, British, German, and so on, but actually the number of divisions, the troops that they deployed on the Central Front. And in the first period, the US had qualitatively superior forces, and also they had bigger divisions than the French and the British, and the Soviet Union in the Eastern Alliance had again qualitatively superior and more numerous troops on its side of the Central Front. In the second period, we actually see the West Germans, especially after they are allowed to rearm, contributing the bulk of the defense on the Central Front for good reasons. It was in their country that the Third World War was going to be fought over. And we see, for instance, 12 West German divisions compared to 6 American divisions in the second period. In the case of the Warsaw Pact, the balance changes as well. And Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia provided 54% of ground troops, and if I remember correctly, 57% of air troops, of air forces. So the Soviets at that point were not providing the majority. Of course, you could say this is a very slight difference, but I would also argue a very big change, a very big transformation for the Eastern Europeans was the qualitative transformation that they experienced. They were now allowed to have national armies. They started refurbishing their armaments, their weapons, and they became truly able of fighting a major war on the Central Front. So that would be how I think about, how I quantify whether an alliance is balanced or unbalanced.
I think the thrust of the question is whether at the nuclear level, they might be more in balance. That, in other words, French and British forces might be more capable or capable enough, I guess is what the question is suggesting.
So do you mind if I take that now, since you pointed out that I didn't tackle the nuclear aspect? It's important to remember that France left NATO, and its nuclear forces were not integrated in the alliance's E&D strategy. Just 2 years after French forces, the Force de Frappe was actually operational. So the French got nuclear weapons in 1960. It took them about 4 years to be able to mount those weapons on the kind of delivery systems they had, especially their jets. And then very soon after, they actually left the alliance. So at that point, they don't really, whatever they have, the numbers of weapons they have does not really matter to me because they're not part of the alliance anymore. With the British, the point I made earlier, and I would like to make it again now, is that they are highly dependent on the Americans. The kind of forces they dedicated to NATO were actually under the command of an American officer. That was a big concession they had to make, but ultimately they didn't really have a choice. And when it comes down to how they would deter other enemies in other battlefields or in other theaters of operation, that is not something that I am particularly looking at. So I'm focusing on what's happening on a particular, in the European theater of operation. And that's where I see the British being highly dependent on the Americans. So their ability to deter on their own, I would say, is very limited, which is why other experts have called the British nuclear deterrent semi-independent. It's not really a formidable fighting force by itself.
Yeah, I think as they did reserve the right to use their nuclear weapons independent of the United States in a supreme national emergency. I think that was the phrase that Mcmillan used. But as you say, they were for all practical purposes under NATO or US command. But here's another question, which is similar to the first one. It has to do with France. And this is from Alexander Sorg. France left the integrated military command structure and it rejoined in 2009. While there is still a nuclear umbrella in place in NATO. Is this comparable to what Albania and Romania did, actually leaving the alliance? I guess, if I understand the question, compare what France did with what Albania and Romania did.
So my understanding about what is happening with France after 2009 is that they are still not coordinating or not allowing SACEUR to command French nuclear forces. They are keeping autonomy, which is why this concept of strategic autonomy is so important for the French. So yes, they are now back, we could say, since 2009, but they're not in any way subordinated to SACEUR. That's number one. Number two, the fact that NATO continued after the disappearance of the main threat, the reason why it was in existence during the Cold War, I would say creates a different kind of situation when it comes down to END strategy. For END to really have some meaning, there has to be an adversary to protect against. And with the Soviet Union disappearing, I argued that that's not really there for NATO. So the kind of END strategy that NATO has in place after the end of the Cold War is doesn't really fit the categories, or doesn't really make much sense. I'm not in this particular project looking at what happened with NATO or why NATO continued to exist, and what kind of protection it offers against an enemy that doesn't exist. We could say that now that relations with Russia are worsening and have worsened since 2014, that there is a reason, that at least some members see a reason for NATO to have an umbrella, and some countries are even very willing to host nuclear weapons on their territory, Poland being an example. So we could divide this period, this post-Cold War period, in its kind of own phases, where initially there's really not much, not a clear role for nuclear weapons in NATO until relations with Russia get worse. So what France did by coming back is, I would say, not necessarily inconsistent with what I'm arguing. The US is still the dominant player. The French are not willing to surrender their ability to order and to command their nuclear forces to another country. So I don't see a lot of discrepancies between what I was talking about before. But yet again, this falls outside the scope of my current investigation, my current research.
Okay, there's another question from Alexander, and it has to do with the difference between Eisenhower's policy and which in some ways was more liberal and permissive in terms of control of nuclear weapons, and Kennedy's policy toward allies in terms of control of nuclear weapons. He's asking whether you wouldn't it make sense to differentiate more between the two, the Eisenhower and the Kennedy period.
Right. So that is a very interesting question. Thank you very much. I would say that within the Warsaw Pact, we have actually some similarities. Khrushchev was much more liberal himself. And of course, that had a lot to do with what was happening within NATO. He would openly say that if NATO goes ahead with the MLF, that the Soviet Union would share nuclear weapons with its Eastern European allies. Then he deployed nuclear weapons in Cuba without those weapons having PALs on them. And he realized very quickly just how bad of a decision that was. There was no brinksmanship with Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, and realized that what he did was a massive mistake. So there are some lessons that I would say both sides learn from their nonchalance, their cavalier attitude towards nuclear weapons in the, let's say, early stages of the nuclear age, the first decade and a half or so. But then both sides come to their senses and realize that they have to have tougher control. They have to be ultimately the only ones in charge, or they have to have a veto. They have to have the ability to prevent their allies from using these weapons without permission from the two leading states, from the top leadership. What I would say in addition to this point is that, of course, the preferences of presidents are very important, but ultimately a state like the US or the Soviet Union has a whole bureaucracy working behind closed doors and underpinning or allowing these kinds of processes to happen. In the case of the US, it's true that Eisenhower thought about pulling out of Europe and wanted to get Europe back on its feet to make Europe really strong. And one idea to do so, one way would be to give it nuclear weapons. But ultimately, Congress was very much opposed to that. And despite some scholars arguing that Italy or Germany had de facto control over nuclear weapons, over American nuclear weapons, that was, I would say, not really the case. It was no more the case in NATO than it was in the Warsaw Pact. And if there were instances where things were murky, or it seemed that West Germany could do something by itself, that wouldn't have been what Washington, especially what Congress, had in mind for those nuclear weapons. And in 1960, if I'm not mistaken, there was a congressional mission to West Germany. They realized just how bad a situation was, and that was the driver for installing PALs. This is just about a normal learning process that happened in the case of both alliances. And I wouldn't say that it would be necessary to differentiate between various presidents. Those kinds of lessons seem to be parallel, or there seem to be similarities within NATO and the Warsaw Pact again, when it came down to those kinds of lessons.
You know, if you say that in your article or in your book, I think you can back that up, that you'll have made a very original argument, because I think probably the conventional view is that there is a sharp distinction, a fairly sharp distinction in terms of American obsession with nuclear control between Eisenhower, who was more permissive, and Kennedy, who tightened control. Anyway, here's a question from Cameron Lee, and your fellow Robert Abernethy fellow. I don't know if you've ever met Cameron, who is in Washington now, I believe, but he's working on a PhD on a similar subject at SAIS under Professor Charles Durand, and he has several questions for you. Thank you, Dr. Gheorghe, for this fascinating presentation. what is the purpose of the balance of power within alliances? Balancing against whom? That's his first question. Pretty basic.
Right. So balance of power has actually several meanings in international relations lingo.
But
one of them,
specifically within an alliance, within a group of ostensibly friendly countries.
Absolutely. So going back to what I was saying, there are at least a couple of meanings for this word, for this phrase. One of them is that there is balancing against another state. And of course, this is how we normally use the term. Another meaning is that when there is a balance of power, that means capabilities are roughly equally distributed. And then the third meaning is the one I'm using, a balance of power. Balance of power simply means the configuration, the distribution of power within the alliance. All those three meanings are accepted, or this is sort of how balance of power is defined in IR 101 textbooks. And so I'm choosing the third connotation, the third way of employing the term. So it's not necessarily balancing against someone. When I talk about the balance of power within the alliance, it's simply the distribution of power within the alliance. Power is distributed. Countries have different levels of capabilities, and they pay attention to how much other members, even if they're in the same club, they pay attention to how much power other members have. That's my point.
And they want to have their own, as much of their own as possible, because they don't want to be pushed around or bullied by their ostensible protector.
Exactly.
I mean, as de Gaulle was certainly very, very conscious of that.
Exactly.
And Cameron's second question, to what extent do intra-alliance nuclear arrangements affect nuclear deterrent effects? I guess by that meaning deterring the outside threat.
Excellent question. So I would say that the first situation where we have the nuclear straitjacket, that is, from the point of view of the adversary, the most effective way to deter the adversary. That's the most effective way for the patron, for the country that has the nuclear weapons. Because when they are the only ones calling the shots, or they are the only ones who decide who and when is going to use nuclear weapons, they don't have to worry about entrapment. They don't have to worry that a junior partner is, or in this case, a dependent, will pull them, will drag them into a war that they don't want to be part of. So from the point of view of the patron, the best way of deterring the adversary is to have a nuclear straitjacket. From the point of view of the junior partners, the weaker members, I should say, the best way of deterring the adversary would be nuclear partnership, which means that they have their nuclear weapons. Everybody has nuclear weapons, but that, as I said before, hasn't happened. And so what we end up with is kind of a compromise where there's a nuclear umbrella, the superpower holds a protective shield over the heads of the weaker members and promises them to protect them. But of course, there will be doubts about abandonment and entrapment. So it's not ideal. They are not in a perfect they're not using the optimal strategy. But from the point of view of junior partners, it's better to have a say than not. So from their point of view, they feel more protected against the adversary when there's a nuclear umbrella in place.
And Connor writes again to say, to clarify my previous question, I was referring solely to nuclear capabilities. I think that, Connor, to be fair, I had clarified that for you, I hope anyway. He's stressing the capabilities of French and British submarine-based deterrence today. But there is a third question from Cameron I'd like to mention. By the way, there are a lot of questions coming in. We could be here for a while, which suggests that the talk has stimulated a lot of interest. Cameron's third question is, how would you respond to someone who argues that the imperialistic and hegemonic models were mixed throughout the Cold War? For example, the UK and Italy had different statuses at each phase with regard to nuclear deterrent policy. And also you excluded non-European allies from the analysis. Well, of course, we're talking about NATO, aren't you?
Thank you very much for that as well. So when it comes down to mixed kinds of alliances, I would not argue that there is no coercion within hegemonic alliances. As I showed in my presentation, there were quite a few instances. It's the big difference is that the leading power is now tying itself more closely to the junior partners and promising them more leeway, more leverage, more of a say when it comes down to a hegemonic model. The kind of situation Cameron is mentioning is one where there are power differentials, not just between the leading power and the junior members or the weaker members, but actually power differentials among the junior partners. And I hope to have, I've done some research on this in the case of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Here again, I would build on the work of Professor Harper and how he's showing just how unwilling the French and the Germans were to cooperate without an American presence around them. So they understood that one of them would have to call the shots, but neither one was willing to let the other one do that. So there is a lot of rivalry about these things, about the power differentials among the junior partners. However, that would be a separate chapter in what I hope will be my second book. So I'm afraid that in today's presentation, there was no space for that, but I am mindful and I am aware of that. And I actually think it's a fascinating puzzle as well, the kind of competition that actually can arise within junior members of the same alliance. So you're absolutely right, Cameron. They did have different statuses. They were treated differently by the superpower, and I would argue that led to some competition between them. And that's something I'm going to be looking at in a separate part of this project.
Of course, there was a lot less trust between Germany and France in 1950 than there was 20 years later. In 1950, they didn't trust each other at all, and they were therefore more keen to have an American protection of both, an American mediation, and an America as an insurance policy. So here's another question from Stefan Pietzner. The theory of the nuclear revolution as espoused by Robert Jervis and others suggests that balancing in the nuclear era is largely internally driven, internal balancing, quote unquote, making external sources of power less relevant, that is, territory. Therefore, why should we expect nuclear alliances at all? Do you follow that question?
I do, and I think it's an excellent question. I actually, I am engaging with Professor Jervis's work on this issue of the nuclear revolution and what it means for international relations. He's basically saying that alliances are irrelevant in the nuclear age. There's nothing that a junior partner could bring to the table to make it meaningful, to make the superpower invest any energy. However, that being said, that's not what we observe. If that had been the case, there wouldn't have been NATO, there wouldn't have been the Warsaw Pact. So the point where I differ from arguments put forward by Professor Jervis, by Professor Ken Waltz, is in what leading powers are primarily concerned with. So of course, they want to remain leading powers, but for them to be able to do so, they are very interested in controlling the spread of nuclear weapons. And they understand that if there are no alliances and they don't have these ties through which they can keep an eye on what's happening with other states, they may have countries like France or the UK, and in NATO's case, Italy, West Germany, and Norway and others. You may have actually an increase, a larger number of states joining the nuclear weapons club. So alliances serve a counter-proliferation purpose. This, I would say, is no longer, it has been said by some of my colleagues and friends in the sphere of international security. This, I would hope, is no longer controversial, but I still get a lot of pushback. So I'm actually really glad that this question was raised. It gave me the chance to clarify some of the parts of my argument where the leading state cares deeply about limiting the spread of nuclear weapons, and alliances can serve that function.
Okay, this raises lots of interesting questions, but I have to go on, I have to move down the list. This is from Alan McKenna. Interesting study, he says. Can you say more about the sources of your research? Where did you find information, and did you have any difficulties with this process, verification, question mark? So I guess the question has to do with sources.
Excellent. So once again, this is, I would hope, a funny anecdote. I was doing my research. I was writing a lot when I was in Bologna as a pre-doctoral fellow. And one day I came across these discussions about these conversations within the Warsaw Pact, where they were talking about rotating the Supreme Commander and basically giving the finger on the button to an Eastern European. And I kind of said to myself, this is strange. And I started talking to some of my colleagues and some of my mentors. And I remember to this day that actually one of my mentors' jaw was on the floor when I mentioned the fact that there were these conversations within the Warsaw Pact. So that was sort of a completely accident. I was not looking for that kind of information. Then I discovered that.
But where did you actually find that information?
Where I found it in archival documents. They are available in a variety of languages. I was reading them at that point in Romanian, but they also have been translated from other languages into English. So from German into English, from Russian into English. The Parallel History Project on NATO and the Warsaw Pact actually has a lot of the minutes of the conversations within the Warsaw Pact. So I highly recommend looking at that. And then I also discovered that there were some of these really fascinating and much more technical documents, for instance, about Czech soldiers, Czech troops being able to deploy and deliver Soviet nuclear warheads. Those have been translated for 20 years now in A Cardboard Castle, a collection of documents published by Malcolm Byrne and Wojtek Masny. And it's filled with those kinds of instances. It's just that for some reason people haven't picked up on them. So I took the opportunity to write the study. Are there difficulties with obtaining information? Yes, especially during a pandemic. But luckily I had gathered quite a few, troves of documents before the pandemic started, so I had the opportunity to go back to them and read through them and then produce this analysis.
Okay, this is from an anonymous attendee. To your point of NATO existing after the Cold War, could not a justification be that such an alliance remained prudent as long as its cities existed on the sufferance of nuclear-armed non-democracies? I guess with Russia at the top of the list. I guess what the question is asking is the old, the rationale for NATO during the Cold War did not disappear when the Soviet Union disappeared, because you still had a potential nuclear threat to Western cities from Russia. I hope I'm not misinterpreting the question.
So thank you for that question. I would argue that NATO could have transformed after the end of the Cold War, and the Europeans were much more, they were in a better position in 1989, 1990 to take over their own defenses and to pick up that responsibility, that task, than they were in 1945. So I I can, well, 1949 when NATO was created, but if we think about the US-led alliance, I would start dating it in 1945. So yes, I can see the point about the Russian arsenal remaining in place, but at the same time, Europe was a different Europe. And we could have seen a different kind of arrangement that didn't require a US presence in Europe. So I'm all in favor of European strength and European taking care of European security. That would be my position.
Okay, and here's another question. Actually, this is the last one on the list, also from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that, this is an interesting question, do you think that the United States would react differently based on today on which NATO ally was attacked? Do you think that the US would react less stridently, I guess less vigorously, if Tallinn were vaporized as opposed to Rome? I'm not sure that the Russians would vaporize Tallinn. They might send in armored divisions, but I guess it's an interesting question. Can the Estonians rely on Article 5 protection to the same extent that Italians presumably can rely on it? It doesn't have to do with nuclear weapons, really, but it's an interesting question.
I agree. It's an excellent point, and I have a controversial opinion about this. I think the US would not respond to either Rome or Tallinn being vaporized. I think it would be national suicide for them to do so. And despite the alliance being crippled and NATO possibly disappearing completely, after something like this, after the US failing to respond, I just don't see American decision makers being so inclined to enter a nuclear war for the sake of an ally. So,
but what if it was not a nuclear war? After all, the classic Cold War scenario, the NATO scenario, which they were preparing for, was that the Soviet Union would launch a conventional attack. And that maybe with very limited use of nuclear weapons, but that would be NATO would be the first user, and the promise that the threat to be the first user was at the core of NATO deterrent doctrine. So I guess the question could be slightly altered or modified to ask you what if there were a conventional attack on Estonia? Would the United States react? I mean, maybe it's not really a fair question, but
I think not. I think the risk of escalation is so great, and Baltic countries, or I would actually say all Eastern European countries, are strategically such liabilities that the US would, understanding that could lead to a general war, possibly a nuclear war, I think they would not come to protect the new Europeans, the new NATO members, which is why I think these NATO members are so nervous. They understand that policymakers in Washington, a lot of them probably have no idea where Tallinn is. And the point of reacting is, and possibly getting into a bigger war, I think is probably not, I would argue would not happen.
I think you're right. I think that those countries, the Baltics, for example, would have good reason to question whether the United States would actually, American public opinion may not even be aware that the United States would be required by treaty to go to the aid of Estonia. But of course, in recent years, we have this so-called advanced forward presence. There has been, including American troops, are more present physically on the ground in Poland and in the Baltics, which may marginally reassure those countries and may marginally enhance deterrence. But in any case, it's another for another evening. And now there's another question which has just come in. No U.S. treaty ally post the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has made a major effort to create their own bomb, implying that our security guarantee is deemed credible enough. And I guess that's right, since France, no NATO ally, has pursued an independent nuclear force. Do you imagine this will continue into the future? And if not, which state do you view as most likely to doubt the US enough to start their own bomb program in earnest? Like, we're talking here about NATO, I think. Or maybe not. I guess we could be talking about Japan or Taiwan, which is a semi-ally, not a treaty ally. What do you think?
Thank you for the question. Really,
the countries taking a leaf out of de Gaulle's book in the future.
Can I answer? So
Yeah.
The NPT is a very interesting treaty, and I would say probably it will be superseded. It has been challenged by the ban treaty, which came into force in January of this year. So the US now is officially, just as France and the UK, they are illegally possessing nuclear weapons. They are possessing nuclear weapons against an international treaty that prohibits their possession. When it comes down to proliferation among NATO allies, the reason why my response would be the following. Indeed, there has not been a major effort among NATO allies to get their own nuclear weapons after the NPT, because they didn't need to launch a major effort. And that's not necessarily, it has something to do with the security guarantee that the US provides, but it also has a lot to do with the loophole that is involved, that is included in the NPT. The NPT gives signatories the right to benefit to the fullest of the peaceful nuclear, of the peaceful uses of the atom, and they are also allowed to have the full nuclear fuel cycle. So what we have after 1968 is a kind of behavior that countries like Germany, I would argue, has engaged in, and others in the future could engage in as well. And that is nuclear hedging. When a country hedges their bets, they are not 100% sure that they're going to be saved in case of a crisis. They're also not 100% skeptical and dismissive or distrustful. They are just trying to stay safe. And Germany, as well as Italy for a while, they have the capability to go, and I would argue actually Japan is probably the best case in this regard. They have the capability to go nuclear in a fairly short period of time. In the case of a country like Germany, the idea of a nuclear weapon is of course verboten. But that is in the current situation where there is an American nuclear guarantee. I would argue that if we have a dramatic shift in the security landscape in Europe, that Germany would probably be more inclined to have some sort of a Euro deterrent arrangement in place with France, or depending, of course, on the domestic configuration, the leadership, the political situation in Germany, we could see certain political forces within Germany pushing for an independent nuclear deterrent. So my answer right now is that yes, indeed, there haven't been such major efforts, because a lot of, the countries that would have had the reason to doubt the US could maintain a hedging posture. So, and when it comes down to who is likely to start or to go down this road in the future, you may have seen news about Turkey's president criticizing the nuclear powers for having nuclear weapons while denying them to other states. I don't see at this point a lot of indicators in Turkey itself that they're going down this road, because they only have research reactors and they're building a nuclear power plant. There's not much you can do with those. But if I see Turkey going for either enrichment technology or reprocessing technology, then I would say Turkey is probably aiming for hedging. It's probably trying to become a hedger, and then in the case of a crisis and nuclear weapons in a fairly short period of time. I also think Poland may go down this road, and I also think Romania may go down this road if the situation in Europe deteriorates in a dramatic way over a short period of time.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. If we weren't, I could ask you to elaborate on the Romanian fascination with nuclear weapons and nuclear matters in general, going back to Ceausescu, and then the origins of your own interest in the subject, interestingly. But I think we're going to have to say that for another time. I would have many more questions to ask you. Unfortunately, I think we should probably call it to a halt. If you have any final comments, I think it was a really interesting discussion, by the way. And I think that the proof is in the pudding, the number of questions that we got. There's even one more question slipping in right under the wire here. So we do have technically, I think, 2 minutes. So another anonymous attendee. Those who dismiss minimal deterrence on the part of the US cite its extended deterrence to allies. Minimal deterrence. Does that have a technical meaning for you? Okay. But you mentioned that the US would probably not respond to a nuclear attack on a core NATO ally. Should the US reduce its arsenal to lower levels then?
Absolutely. I think deterrence at low levels, as some people call it, is what the US should pursue at this moment. It will be, of course, a very difficult thing to do for domestic reasons, because maybe some countries will start doubting the US more, but minimal deterrence is likely to reduce the risk of an accidental nuclear war, and therefore it's the only way that we can have a safer environment instead of what we are seeing now, which is going in the complete opposite direction. Or actually, that was more the case until January. I think now New START has been renewed, so hopefully we're making some steps in the right direction. But modernization is still on the books. It's still on the table. So what I would say is yes, the U.S. should pursue minimal deterrence to the best of its abilities. It's not going to put its national interest in jeopardy. It's not going to create more insecurity. It's only going to signal to its now adversaries, because they have become adversaries, Russia and China, that it's not going to launch a first strike, that it's using nuclear weapons. The sole purpose of nuclear weapons is defense, is deterrence. So I think going that direction is likely to make the whole world, for all of us, a more secure place. And I think that's a very optimistic, very nice note to end on. But before ending, I realized that it's exactly 9 o'clock. It's 8 o'clock in Bologna. I would like to thank Professor Harper and SAIS Bologna for the invitation. It was an honor to give a talk and to be back, albeit just virtually. Hopefully we'll see each other in person not too far from now, not too long from now. And also to thank all the attendees for their very insightful and thought-provoking questions. I really appreciate it, and I hope to get the chance to see some of the attendees in person next time when I'm in Bologna.
Okay, well, Eliza, it was an enjoyable session, and we would certainly like to thank you. And we would endorse 100% your hope that you can be here in person. One last, I can't resist, as an historian, one footnote. For those of you who are interested in this subject, there's an interesting French literature from the early 60s. Pierre Gallois, who talked about proportional deterrence, and André Beaufre. These people are maybe worth reading again on the subject of minimal deterrence, Gallois in particular. So that's it. And I'd love to have a glass of wine. Wish we all could, but we'll do that sometime. We'll postpone that until your visit. And let's you and I be in touch. We can talk more about this.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
It was wonderful seeing you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
And thanks, Alessandra.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Okay. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.